Picture this. It's 4 a.m. in ancient Rome, and while the city sleeps, a young recruit named Marcus is being dragged from his straw bed by a centurion whose voice could shatter marble, thrown into the freezing waters of the Tiber River, and forced to swim to the other side while carrying a full pack of weapons and armor, knowing that if he drowns, he was never worthy of calling himself a Roman soldier in the first place. And this, my friends, is just the beginning of what historians call the most brutal, systematic, and effective military training program in human history. A program so intense that it transformed ordinary farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants into the legendary warriors who conquered half the known world, built an empire that lasted over 1,000 years, and created a military machine so feared that barbarian tribes would surrender at the mere sight of Roman eagles on the horizon. But what you're about to discover will shock you, because the training that forged these unstoppable warriors makes modern military boot camps look like summer vacation. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why Roman soldiers weren't just fighters. They were superhuman killing machines who could march 25 miles a day in full armor, build fortified camps from scratch every single night, fight battles that lasted from dawn to dusk, and then do it all over again the next day for decades without breaking. And the secret wasn't just their weapons or tactics, it was a training system so brutal that only 1 in 10 recruits survived to become a full legionnaire. A system that broke men down to their very core and rebuilt them into something that transcended human limitations, something that modern special forces still study and try to emulate today. The journey to becoming a Roman legionnaire began long before a young man ever set foot in a training camp, because the Roman military recruiters, known as conquistors, didn't just accept anyone who showed up with a sword and a dream. Oh no. These were men who could spot potential warriors from a crowd of thousands, and they had standards that would make today's elite military units weep with envy. Starting with the physical requirements that eliminated 90% of applicants before they even began training, because a potential recruit had to be at least 5 feet 10 inches tall when the average Roman male was barely 5 feet 5 inches, had to possess perfect vision, hearing, and teeth, needed to demonstrate the ability to lift and carry 60 pounds of equipment for hours without rest, and most importantly, had to prove he came from a family with enough money to buy his own equipment, because the Roman army didn't provide gear. They expected soldiers to invest their own wealth into becoming instruments of war, which meant that only the most dedicated and financially committed men even made it to the recruitment line, where they faced the most terrifying interview process in ancient history, conducted by veterans whose scars told stories of battles across 3 continents. Men who could look into a recruit's eyes and instantly know whether he had the killer instinct necessary to survive what was coming next, because they would ask questions like, "Are you prepared to watch your best friend die in agony and continue fighting? Can you kill a man with your bare hands if your sword breaks? And will you choose death before dishonor when the enemy offers you gold to betray Rome?" And the wrong answer, even a moment's hesitation, meant immediate rejection and a lifetime of shame in your hometown. But for those rare few who passed this initial screening, who convinced these battle-hardened veterans that they possessed the raw material to be forged into Roman steel, the real nightmare was just beginning, because they were immediately shipped off to training camps located in the most hostile, unforgiving environments the empire could find. Places like the German frontier where winter temperatures could freeze a man solid, the deserts of North Africa where the sun could bake recruits to death in their own armor, or the marshlands of Britain where disease and exhaustion killed more men than enemy weapons ever would. The moment new recruits arrived at these camps, they discovered that their old lives, their old identities, even their own names no longer mattered, because the Roman training system was designed around one simple principle: complete destruction of the civilian mind and its replacement with the warrior soul, which began with the infamous Week of Tears. 7 days of non-stop psychological and physical torment that killed or drove insane approximately 30% of new arrivals, starting with the ritual head shaving that stripped away personal identity, followed by the confiscation of all personal belongings including letters from family, religious tokens, and anything that connected recruits to their former lives. Then came the branding, not with a hot iron like slaves, but with the spiritual branding of absolute obedience, as drill sergeants called munifics screamed Latin curses that would make demons blush while forcing recruits to stand at attention for 18 hours straight without food, water, or permission to relieve themselves, and any recruit who collapsed, complained, or showed the slightest sign of weakness was immediately beaten with wooden staffs called fasces until he either got back up or was carried away on a stretcher, never to be seen again, because Roman military doctrine held that it was better to eliminate the weak early than to have them fail their comrades in actual combat. Which is why the training incorporated psychological torture techniques that would be considered war crimes today, including forced marches through freezing rivers while carrying wounded comrades, surprise attacks by instructors dressed as barbarian warriors who would kill recruits with wooden weapons if they failed to react fast enough, and the dreaded Night of Ghosts, where veteran soldiers would sneak into barracks and terrorize sleeping recruits with realistic reenactments of battlefield horrors, complete with fake blood, severed limbs, and the authentic screams of dying men, all designed to condition young minds for the psychological trauma of actual warfare, because Romans understood that battles weren't won or lost by the strongest or fastest soldiers. They were won by the men who could keep fighting even when everything around them had descended into hell on earth. Physical conditioning in Roman training camps defied every understanding of human limitations, because these weren't just exercises designed to build muscle and endurance. They were systematic torture methods disguised as fitness routines, engineered to push the human body beyond its breaking point and then rebuild it into something superhuman. Starting with the morning routine that began every day at 4 a.m. regardless of weather, season, or the physical condition of the recruits, who were dragged from their beds by centurions wielding whips and forced to run 10 miles in full armor weighing 60 pounds while carrying their shields, javelins, short swords, daggers, construction tools, cooking equipment, and 3 days' worth of food, all while maintaining perfect formation and singing marching songs in Latin. And anyone who fell behind was beaten. Anyone who dropped their equipment was beaten. Anyone who sang off-key was beaten. And anyone who showed signs of exhaustion was beaten. Twice as hard because weakness was considered a disease that could spread to other soldiers if not eliminated immediately. But the morning run was just the warm-up, because after returning to camp, recruits were immediately thrown into weapons training that lasted 8 hours without breaks, starting with sword work against wooden posts called pali that were designed to be harder than human bone, forcing recruits to hack away with wooden training swords that were twice the weight of real weapons, until their arms could barely lift a cup of water, and the instructors, all veteran gladiators and retired legionnaires with decades of combat experience, would circle like vultures, striking recruits with sticks whenever their form was imperfect, their footwork sloppy, or their killing strikes insufficiently vicious, because Roman sword fighting wasn't about elegant dueling or honorable combat. It was about efficiently butchering human beings in the fastest, most brutal manner possible, which required training that was equally brutal, equally unforgiving, and absolutely without mercy for human weakness or sentiment. The weapons training alone would have broken most modern soldiers, but it was merely one component of a larger system designed to forge superhuman warriors, because Roman recruits also had to master the gladius, the short sword that became synonymous with Roman military dominance, learning not just how to thrust and slash, but how to kill a man in 47 different ways depending on his armor, position, and fighting style, studying the anatomy of death with the precision of surgeons and the enthusiasm of madmen, because instructors would bring in condemned criminals and force recruits to practice killing techniques on living human beings, watching how different wounds affected mobility, studying how long it took various injuries to cause death, and learning to recognize the exact moment when an enemy warrior transitioned from dangerous opponent to harmless corpse, skills that could only be learned through repeated exposure to actual human slaughter, which explains why Roman training camps maintained private execution grounds where recruits could practice their craft on a steady supply of criminals, prisoners of war, and occasionally, other recruits who had failed to meet standards, because the Roman military operated on the principle that a soldier who hesitated to kill was more dangerous to his comrades than any enemy warrior, and such hesitation could only be eliminated through systematic desensitization to human death, achieved by forcing young men to commit acts of violence that would haunt their dreams for the rest of their lives but would also ensure they never froze up when Roman lives depended on their ability to kill quickly and efficiently. Shield work represented another dimension of torture disguised as training, because the Roman scutum wasn't just a defensive tool, it was a weapon capable of crushing skulls, breaking bones, and knocking enemies off their feet, weighing 22 pounds and requiring techniques that modern athletes would find impossible to master, starting with the basic shield wall formation where recruits had to stand shoulder to shoulder with their shields overlocked for hours at a time while instructors hurled javelins, rocks, and flaming arrows at them, testing whether they could maintain formation while under attack, because the shield wall was the foundation of Roman military tactics, and any weakness in the formation meant death for everyone involved, so recruits who broke formation, flinched from incoming projectiles, or failed to coordinate their movements with their neighbors were immediately pulled from the line and beaten unconscious with wooden clubs, then forced to repeat the exercise until they performed it perfectly, even if it took weeks of daily beatings and humiliation, because Roman military doctrine held that individual survival was meaningless compared to unit cohesion, and soldiers who couldn't subordinate their personal fear to collective action were considered worse than cowards. They were active threats to Roman security who needed to be eliminated before they infected other troops with their weakness, which is why shield training included exercises where instructors would deliberately target individual recruits with multiple attackers, forcing them to defend themselves while maintaining their position in formation, an impossible task that resulted in severe injuries and occasional deaths, but also produced soldiers who could fight effectively even when overwhelmed by superior numbers. Javelin training pushed physical conditioning into the realm of the supernatural, because Roman soldiers weren't just expected to throw their pila with accuracy, They had to master techniques that allowed them to kill enemies at distances up to 100 feet while running at full speed, wearing full armor, and often while under attack from enemy archers, which required shoulder strength, core stability, and hand-eye coordination that took years to develop, starting with basic throwing exercises, where recruits had to hit man-sized targets at 50 feet, 500 times per day, every day, for 6 months, using javelins that weighed 5 pounds each and could penetrate armor at close range. But accuracy was only the beginning, because combat throwing required recruits to master advanced techniques like the overhand power throw that could punch through enemy shields, the sidearm snap throw for close-quarters combat, and the devastating underhand flip that could take out an enemy's legs and send him tumbling into his own comrades, disrupting enemy formations and creating opportunities for sword work, skills that could only be developed through endless repetition under increasingly difficult conditions, which is why instructors would force recruits to practice throwing while running up steep hills, while being pelted with stones, while carrying wounded comrades, and while fighting off multiple attackers with their shields, because battlefield conditions were unpredictable and chaotic, and soldiers who could only perform under perfect conditions were useless to the Roman war machine. So training had to be more difficult, more painful, and more terrifying than actual combat, ensuring that real battles would seem easy by comparison. A psychological technique that gave Roman soldiers an almost supernatural confidence in their own abilities and made them willing to charge into situations that would have terrified other warriors. Construction training revealed the true genius of Roman military engineering, because legionnaires weren't just fighters, they were also the most skilled construction workers in the ancient world, capable of building roads, bridges, fortifications, siege engines, and entire cities with nothing more than basic tools and raw determination. Skills that required a different kind of physical conditioning, one that emphasized endurance, precision, and the ability to perform complex manual labor under combat conditions, which began with basic carpentry exercises where recruits had to build increasingly complex wooden structures using only hand tools, starting with simple furniture and progressing to catapults, ballistae, and siege towers that could breach enemy fortifications. But the real test came with road construction, the legendary Roman roads that allowed armies to move rapidly across vast distances and maintain communication between distant outposts, projects that required recruits to quarry stone, mix concrete, survey terrain, and lay foundations with mathematical precision, all while wearing full armor and maintaining combat readiness, because enemy attacks could come at any time, and Roman soldiers had to be prepared to drop their hammers and pick up their swords at a moment's notice, which meant that construction training was conducted under constant harassment from instructors who would stage mock attacks, forcing recruits to defend themselves while protecting their work and their tools, because Roman engineering projects were so valuable that enemy forces would specifically target them, and soldiers who couldn't fight while working were as useless as workers who couldn't work while fighting. The daily construction requirements would have killed modern construction workers, because recruits were expected to move 2 tons of stone and concrete every day, lay 500 feet of road foundation, and build defensive fortifications capable of withstanding siege weapons, all while maintaining equipment, preparing meals, and standing guard duty, tasks that required them to work 16-hour days in weather conditions ranging from freezing rain to blazing desert heat, and failure to meet daily quotas resulted in punishment details that could last all night, forcing exhausted recruits to work even harder while their comrades slept. A system designed to eliminate anyone who couldn't maintain peak performance under maximum stress, because Roman armies operated in hostile territory where there was no room for weakness, no time for rest, and no forgiveness for failure. So training had to prepare soldiers for situations where they might have to march all day, and then stand guard duty all night, repeating this cycle for weeks without relief. Standards that seem impossible until you realize that Roman legions actually did exactly this during campaigns like the conquest of Gaul, where Julius Caesar's armies marched over 2,000 miles, fought dozens of major battles, built hundreds of fortified camps, and conquered an area larger than modern France, all in less than 8 years. Achievements that were only possible because Roman training had prepared soldiers for exactly these kinds of superhuman demands. Combat simulation exercises pushed psychological conditioning to levels that would be illegal in modern militaries, because Roman training included realistic battle scenarios where recruits faced actual life-or-death situations, starting with gladiatorial combat where small groups of recruits were forced to fight each other with real weapons, not to the death, but until blood was drawn and clear winners established. Matches that resulted in serious injuries, permanent disabilities, and occasional deaths that were considered acceptable losses in the pursuit of military excellence, because Romans believed that soldiers who had never been wounded, never felt their own blood flowing, never experienced the terror of facing an opponent who was genuinely trying to kill them, were not truly prepared for actual combat, which is why training included exercises like the gauntlet, where individual recruits had to fight their way through lines of instructors armed with clubs and whips, suffering real injuries while trying to reach the other end, or the wolf pack, where groups of recruits were released into forests filled with veteran soldiers who hunted them like animals, using every dirty trick and brutal tactic that might be encountered in actual warfare, exercises that taught valuable lessons about survival, evasion, and combat under stress, but also claimed the lives of recruits who weren't fast enough, smart enough, or tough enough to survive, deaths that were recorded in official documents as training accidents but were actually deliberate culling of the weak, a practice that modern people would consider murder but Romans viewed as essential quality control. Psychological warfare training prepared recruits for the mental horrors of ancient combat, exposing them to sights, sounds, and experiences that would break civilian minds but were necessary preparation for the realities of military service, starting with visits to execution grounds where recruits were forced to watch as criminals were crucified, beheaded, torn apart by wild animals, or killed in other spectacular ways, not for entertainment but as education in human mortality, teaching future soldiers that death was commonplace, inevitable, and nothing to be feared, because fear of death was the greatest weakness a warrior could possess, leading to hesitation, panic, and tactical errors that could doom entire units. So recruits had to be systematically desensitized to violence and death through repeated exposure to the worst humanity could inflict on itself, which included forced participation in mass executions where recruits had to personally kill condemned prisoners, learning to overcome natural human reluctance to take life and replacing it with cold, professional efficiency, skills that were reinforced through theatrical performances where veteran actors would reenact famous battles complete with realistic gore, sound effects, and psychological manipulation designed to trigger fight-or-flight responses in controlled environments where recruits could learn to manage their fear without endangering their comrades. Because Roman military theory held that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was the ability to function effectively while terrified, a distinction that could only be learned through repeated exposure to terrifying situations under controlled conditions. The legendary Roman discipline that made their armies invincible wasn't achieved through inspiration or patriotic speeches. It was beaten into recruits through a system of punishment that would violate every human rights convention ever written, starting with minor infractions like being late for formation, speaking without permission, or showing insufficient enthusiasm, violations that resulted in flogging with leather whips embedded with metal studs, beatings that left permanent scars and served as constant reminders of the price of disobedience, but serious offenses like cowardice, desertion, or striking a superior officer carried punishments that were designed to be worse than death, including decimation, where 1 out of every 10 soldiers in a disgraced unit was selected by lottery and beaten to death by his own comrades, a practice that ensured unit loyalty by making every soldier responsible for the behavior of his brothers, because knowing that your cowardice could result in the death of innocent friends created powerful motivation to perform at maximum levels regardless of personal fear or exhaustion, and for the ultimate crime of mutiny or treason, Roman military law prescribed crucifixion, the most agonizing and humiliating death the ancient world could devise, a fate so terrible that even the toughest soldiers would choose suicide rather than face it, which explains why Roman armies maintained discipline even in the most desperate situations, when defeat seemed certain and survival impossible, because soldiers knew that capture by the enemy offered better prospects than punishment by their own officers. Food in Roman training camps was deliberately inadequate, not due to supply problems but as part of systematic conditioning designed to prepare soldiers for the realities of campaign life, where adequate nutrition was never guaranteed and fighting effectiveness had to be maintained despite hunger, thirst, and malnutrition. So recruits received daily rations that provided barely enough calories to survive their brutal training schedule, a diet consisting mainly of hardtack, vinegar, olive oil, and occasionally meat that was often spoiled or infested with insects, meals that had to be prepared by the recruits themselves using basic cooking equipment while maintaining all their other duties, because Roman soldiers were expected to be self-sufficient in all aspects of military life, capable of surviving in hostile territory without supply lines or external support, skills that could only be learned through practical experience with genuine hardship, which is why training camps were deliberately located in areas where food was scarce, water was contaminated, and local populations were hostile, forcing recruits to forage, hunt, and steal what they needed to survive while completing their training requirements and maintaining combat readiness. Conditions that eliminated recruits who couldn't adapt to genuine hardship and produced soldiers who could march for weeks on minimal rations, fight major battles while exhausted and malnourished, and maintain morale even when facing starvation, capabilities that proved decisive in campaigns like Hannibal's invasion of Italy, where Roman armies continued fighting effectively despite supply problems that would have destroyed less disciplined forces. Sleep deprivation was another weapon in the Roman training arsenal, because soldiers who couldn't function without adequate rest were liabilities in combat situations where sleep was a luxury few could afford. So recruits were systematically deprived of rest through rotating guard duties, night training exercises, and emergency drills that could be called at any hour, creating chronic exhaustion that tested mental stability and physical endurance while teaching valuable lessons about maintaining alertness under stress, because enemy attacks often came at dawn, during storms, or at other times when defenders would normally be sleeping, and soldiers who were groggy, slow, or mentally confused made easy targets for well-rested enemies, which is why Roman training included exercises like the Long Night, where recruits had to remain awake and combat-ready for 48 hours straight while performing increasingly complex tasks that required concentration, coordination, and quick decision-making, Tests that revealed which men could maintain peak performance despite total exhaustion and which ones became dangerous liabilities when deprived of sleep. Information that determined not only who would graduate from training but also which positions they would be assigned in actual units. Because Roman military organization was based on matching individual capabilities with specific roles, ensuring that every soldier was placed where he could contribute most effectively to unit performance. Who couldn't treat themselves or their comrades were burdens that could doom entire units. So recruits learned battlefield medicine through hands-on experience with real injuries, real blood, and real pain, starting with basic wound treatment practiced on themselves and each other. Using knives, needles, and cauterizing irons to close cuts, remove foreign objects, and prevent infection. Procedures that were performed without anesthesia or pain relief because battlefield conditions rarely provided such luxuries, and soldiers had to learn to work effectively despite their own agony or the screams of wounded comrades. Skills that were developed through training exercises where recruits would deliberately injure each other with swords, spears, and arrows, then practice emergency treatment under combat conditions while instructors threw rocks, shot blunts, and created chaos designed to simulate actual battlefield conditions, because wounded soldiers were prime targets for enemy troops who understood that nothing disrupted unit cohesion like watching comrades die from treatable injuries. So Roman training emphasized speed, efficiency, and emotional detachment when dealing with severe trauma, teaching soldiers to view wounded humans as mechanical problems that required technical solutions rather than fellow beings deserving of sympathy or gentle treatment. A psychological adaptation that allowed Roman medics to work effectively in situations that would paralyze civilian doctors. Advanced combat training pushed recruits into scenarios that seemed designed by sadists, because Roman military doctrine recognized that battles were won by soldiers who could adapt to unexpected situations, think creatively under stress, and improvise solutions when standard tactics failed, capabilities that could only be developed through exposure to impossible challenges that forced creative problem-solving under maximum pressure. Starting with scenarios like the bridge, where small groups of recruits had to capture and hold a narrow crossing against overwhelming enemy numbers using only standard equipment and their own ingenuity. Exercises that usually resulted in total defeat but taught valuable lessons about resource management, tactical flexibility, and the importance of creative thinking in desperate situations, because real battles rarely went according to plan, and soldiers who could only follow orders were less valuable than those who could recognize opportunities, adapt to changing conditions, and take initiative when leadership was killed or communications were cut. Skills that were developed through increasingly complex scenarios that required recruits to switch between different roles, master multiple weapon systems, coordinate with unfamiliar units, and make life-or-death decisions with incomplete information. Training that produced soldiers who could function as individual warriors, unit leaders, engineers, medics, or scouts depending on battlefield requirements. The psychological pressure of advanced training was designed to break minds that couldn't handle the stress of actual warfare, using techniques that modern psychologists would classify as torture, including sensory deprivation exercises where recruits were confined in dark, silent cells for days at a time while hallucinating enemies, reliving traumatic training experiences, and gradually losing their grip on reality. Ordeals that revealed which men possessed the mental stability necessary for long campaigns in hostile territory and which ones would crack under pressure, becoming dangerous to themselves and their comrades. Information that was carefully recorded by training officers who maintained detailed psychological profiles on every recruit, tracking individual responses to different types of stress and identifying optimal assignments for graduates. Because Roman armies were complex organizations that required many different types of specialists, from frontline fighters who thrived on violence and chaos to engineers who needed steady nerves and mathematical precision, and matching personalities with positions was essential for maximum effectiveness, which explains why Roman training included aptitude tests disguised as torture sessions, psychological evaluations conducted through combat exercises, and personality assessments based on reactions to impossible challenges, all designed to extract maximum information about individual capabilities while eliminating recruits who lacked the mental toughness necessary for military service. Graduation from Roman military training was not a celebration. It was a final test that killed approximately 20% of the recruits who had survived everything else, because the Roman military wanted to be absolutely certain that new soldiers possessed not only the skills and conditioning necessary for combat, but also the commitment and loyalty that would prevent them from breaking under the ultimate pressure, which is why the final examination was a live combat exercise against veteran troops. Using real weapons and real tactics, battles that were fought to the death between units of new recruits and experienced soldiers who had been ordered to show no mercy, test the graduates to their absolute limits, and eliminate anyone who hadn't truly mastered the lessons of Roman military training. Conflicts that were presented as training exercises but were actually battles for survival where graduation depended on proving that you were willing and able to kill or be killed for the glory of Rome. And these final tests claimed so many lives that training camps maintained mass graves for recruits who had completed months of brutal conditioning only to die in the last days of their preparation. But those who survived these ultimate challenges emerged as something more than human, transformed by their ordeal into living weapons who possessed capabilities that seemed impossible to civilian observers. Men who could march 25th miles in full armor, build fortified camps in a single afternoon, fight battles that lasted from dawn to dusk, and repeat this cycle for years without breaking. Soldiers whose loyalty to Rome was absolute, whose discipline was unbreakable, and whose effectiveness in combat was so superior to other armies that they seemed to possess supernatural powers. The transformation from civilian to legionnaire was so complete that graduates barely resembled the men who had entered training, because the Roman military system didn't just teach fighting techniques, it fundamentally rewired human psychology, replacing individual survival instincts with collective loyalty, personal ambition with military duty, and civilian morality with warrior ethics that prioritized Roman victory above all other considerations, changes that were achieved through systematic destruction of recruits' previous identities followed by reconstruction around military values, a process that was deliberately traumatic and irreversible, ensuring that graduates could never return to civilian life with the same attitudes and priorities they had possessed before training. Because Roman soldiers were designed to be a separate class of humanity, warrior priests whose religion was military service, whose purpose was conquest, and whose greatest happiness came from victory in battle, psychological conditioning that produced armies of fanatical devotion to Roman interests, men who would march into hell itself if ordered to do so, by legitimate authority, and who viewed death in battle as the highest honor a human being could achieve, attitudes that made Roman armies nearly invincible against opponents who were fighting for more conventional motivations like territory, wealth, or political power. The daily routine of a fully trained Roman legionnaire would have broken modern special forces soldiers, because these men were expected to maintain peak physical conditioning while performing multiple demanding roles, starting each day at 4 a.m. with physical training that included running, swimming, wrestling, and weapons practice, followed by construction work that might involve building roads, fortifications, or siege equipment, then tactical drills that rehearsed complex maneuvers and battle formations, then equipment maintenance that kept weapons and armor in perfect condition, then guard duties that required constant alertness for enemy activity, and finally administrative tasks that maintained unit records, supply inventories, and communication with higher command. A schedule that typically required 16 to 18 hours of active duty with only brief breaks for meals and equipment changes. Standards that were maintained 7 days a week regardless of weather, terrain, or proximity to enemy forces, because Roman military doctrine held that constant activity was necessary to maintain the psychological conditioning that made legionnaires effective, and any relaxation of standards would begin a process of mental deterioration that would eventually destroy unit effectiveness, which is why Roman armies maintained their brutal pace even during winter quarters, peacetime garrison duty, and long marches between battles, ensuring that soldiers never lost the edge that had been so painfully acquired during training. Roman battle tactics were the ultimate expression of their training philosophy, combining individual skill with collective discipline to create formations that could adapt to any enemy or terrain while maintaining overwhelming psychological pressure on opponents. Starting with the famous testudo or tortoise formation where soldiers locked their shields together to create an impenetrable shell that could advance under heavy missile fire, a technique that required perfect coordination between dozens of men who had to move as a single organism while maintaining defensive integrity. But the testudo was just one of many formations that Roman armies could assume instantly on command, including the wedge for breaking enemy lines, the circle for all-around defense, the line for maximum offensive power, and dozens of specialized arrangements for specific tactical situations, all of which had to be executed flawlessly under combat conditions by soldiers who were simultaneously fighting for their lives, protecting their comrades, and following complex orders from officers who might be killed or wounded at any moment. Challenges that could only be met by troops whose training had prepared them for exactly these kinds of demands. Soldiers who could think tactically while fighting individually, coordinate their movements with multiple comrades while engaging separate enemies, and adapt to changing conditions without losing formation integrity or offensive momentum. The legendary Roman gladius, the short sword that became synonymous with military dominance, was perfectly designed for the close-quarters combat that Roman tactics emphasized. A weapon that was optimized for thrusting attacks that could penetrate armor and kill quickly in the press of battle. But mastering the gladius required training that pushed swordplay beyond mere technique into the realm of instinctive reaction, because Roman soldiers had to be able to kill multiple enemies in rapid succession while maintaining formation discipline, protecting their shields, and coordinating with comrades who were engaged in their own life-or-death struggles. Capabilities that demanded countless hours of practice against every possible opponent configuration, from single enemies with different weapons and fighting styles to multiple attackers coming from various directions. Training that included fighting while wounded, fighting in complete darkness, fighting while exhausted, and fighting while emotionally devastated by the death of close friends. Scenarios that prepared Roman swordsmen for the psychological chaos of actual combat where nothing went according to plan and survival depended on split-second decisions made under maximum stress. Skills that gave Roman infantry such a decisive advantage that enemy armies would often break and run rather than face them in close combat. The Roman javelin, or pilum, was engineered as both a missile weapon and a psychological warfare tool, designed with a soft iron shank that would bend upon impact, making it impossible for enemies to throw back while simultaneously disabling their shields, forcing them to abandon defensive equipment just as Roman sword attacks began. But throwing the pilum effectively under combat conditions required strength, accuracy, and timing that could only be developed through years of intensive training. Because legionnaires had to be able to hit man-sized targets at distances up to 100 feet while running at full speed in formation, wearing 60 pounds of equipment, and often while under attack from enemy missiles, a combination of requirements that demanded superhuman levels of physical conditioning and hand-eye coordination. Skills that were developed through training exercises that gradually increased in difficulty until recruits could perform impossible feats like hitting moving targets while jumping obstacles, throwing accurately while being attacked by multiple opponents, and maintaining rate of fire while advancing through difficult terrain. Capabilities that gave Roman armies a decisive advantage in the opening phases of battle when javelin volleys could disrupt enemy formations before sword work began. Roman military engineering capabilities were so advanced that enemy armies often surrendered rather than face the siege equipment and fortifications that legionnaires could construct with amazing speed and precision. Because Roman soldiers weren't just fighters, they were also skilled carpenters, stonemasons, surveyors, and architects who could build everything from simple bridges to complex siege towers using only basic tools and local materials. Skills that were developed through construction projects that were deliberately more difficult than anything they would encounter in actual warfare, starting with basic carpentry exercises using hand tools to create increasingly complex wooden structures, then advancing to stonework that required precise measurements and mathematical calculations, then mastering concrete construction techniques that allowed Romans to build structures that are still standing today. But the real test of engineering training came with siege warfare exercises where recruits had to design and build catapults, ballistae, siege towers, and battering rams capable of breaching enemy fortifications, projects that required not only technical skill but also creativity, problem-solving ability, and the capacity to work effectively under combat conditions, because enemy forces would specifically target Roman engineers, recognizing that their construction capabilities posed the greatest long-term threat to defensive positions. The Roman road system, one of the greatest engineering achievements in human history, was built primarily by legionnaires whose training had prepared them for exactly these kinds of massive construction projects. But building roads that could handle heavy military traffic across all types of terrain required skills that went far beyond simple manual labor, including advanced surveying techniques to determine optimal routes through mountains and across rivers, sophisticated understanding of drainage and foundation work to ensure roads remained passable in all weather conditions, and project management capabilities to coordinate the efforts of thousands of workers across vast distances. Skills that were developed through training exercises that started with simple trail construction and gradually advanced to projects rivaling the complexity of modern highway systems. But unlike modern construction workers, Roman road builders had to maintain combat readiness throughout their projects, because enemy attacks could come at any time, and soldiers who couldn't fight while working were as useless as fighters who couldn't work. Which is why construction training was conducted under constant harassment from instructors who would stage mock attacks, forcing recruits to defend themselves while protecting their work and their tools, preparation that proved invaluable during actual campaigns where Roman armies built over 250,000 miles of roads while simultaneously conquering and occupying hostile territory. Roman logistics and supply systems were so efficient that armies could operate for months in hostile territory without local support. Capabilities that were only possible because every legionnaire had been trained in resource management, foraging, hunting, food preparation, equipment maintenance, and emergency improvisation. Skills that allowed Roman armies to be largely self-sufficient while maintaining combat effectiveness far from home bases. But achieving this level of independence required Training that pushed soldiers beyond normal human limitations, starting with survival exercises where recruits were abandoned in wilderness areas with minimal equipment and forced to find food, water, and shelter while avoiding capture by instructors who hunted them like animals. Ordeals that taught valuable lessons about identifying edible plants, setting snares and traps, purifying contaminated water, and constructing temporary shelters from available materials. Knowledge that could mean the difference between success and disaster during extended campaigns in unfamiliar territory, because Roman armies couldn't rely on local populations for supplies, especially in conquered territories where civilians were often hostile and likely to poison food or sabotage equipment given the opportunity. The psychological impact of Roman military training extended far beyond the armies themselves, because the reputation for invincibility that Roman legions acquired was based on genuine capabilities that enemy forces had witnessed firsthand. Stories of Roman soldiers who could march impossible distances, fight outnumbered and win, construct fortifications overnight, and maintain discipline under conditions that would break other armies. Legends that were backed up by consistent performance. Across multiple continents and centuries of warfare, creating a psychological weapon that was often more effective than actual combat. Because enemy commanders knew that their troops were facing soldiers who had been conditioned to view death as preferable to defeat. Men who would continue fighting even when wounded, surrounded, and cut off from support. Warriors whose training had been so brutal that actual battle seemed easy by comparison. Reputations that caused entire armies to surrender. Without fighting rather than face Roman legions in combat, saving Roman lives while achieving strategic objectives through intimidation rather than violence. An approach that was only possible because Roman training really did produce soldiers.